Hello and welcome back. I'm your host, Terry Phillips. Today we are going to be learning about significant women in the lineage of Christ. We're going to start in the book of Matthew, first chapter, verses 1 through 17, describe document the lineage of Christ starting with Abraham on down to Jesus. We're not going to be reading all of the descendants of Abraham today because we are going to focus on three significant women. So if you will, turn with me to Matthew chapter 1, and we are going to be reading verses 5 and 6. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, and Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. So the first woman we are going to speak about today is Ruth. So let's turn to the book of Ruth. We're not going to read the entire book of Ruth. We're just going to do an overview of who Ruth was and why she was significant in the lineage of Christ. Why was Ruth important? So, in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, we read the story of a man named Elimelech. He and his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, leave Bethlehem and move to the land of Moab. So we are going to start reading in verse 3. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her two sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her two sons and her husband. So this tells the story of a man from Bethlehem who moves his wife and sons to the country of Moab, where he passes away. Then the two sons marry Moabite women, one of which was Ruth. Now, both sons pass away, so now both Naomi and Ruth are widowed. Now, Naomi seeks to release Ruth from her obligation to remain with her, but Ruth, who was formerly a pagan and came to know God and worship God through the marriage of her, her husband's family, is now a godly woman. She does not wish to leave her mother-in-law. So now we look at Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem. So they return to Bethlehem in verse 19 is where they start moving back to Bethlehem. So we're going to fast forward to chapter 2, and we're going to look at verses 8 and 9. Now once they're in Bethlehem, they do find kinsmen there. So chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, this is a kinsman. It says, Then Boaz said to Ruth, You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels, and drink from what the young men have drawn. So this is Boaz's first encounter with Ruth. Boaz was a relative of Naomi's husband. Naomi and Ruth were poor, so they went back to Bethlehem, and they were gathering food from what was left after Boaz's workers harvested. That's what they did back then for the poor. That didn't have anything. The landowners who grew crops left a certain portion for the poor. So Ruth would go out each day to gather behind Boaz's workers. And Boaz was related to Naomi's husband. So he was a kinsman to both ladies through marriage, through their husbands. Now we're going to fast forward in the story a little bit, and we're going to look at chapter 4, verse 13. Now, quite a bit of time has passed, and Ruth has had a lot of contact with Boaz through instruction of Naomi. Now here we are in chapter 4, verse 13, starting in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went in to her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So this is when Ruth bears Obed to Boaz. Now, what is so significant about this story? If we look back to chapter 1, it said Elimelech took his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons from Bethlehem and moved to Moab. Now, why would he have done that? I believe he did that under the urging and instruction of God. Because he moved to Moab, and there his sons met their wives, Orpah and Ruth. So Ruth was a Moabite. She lived in Moab. If Elimelech had not taken his family to Moab, his son would not have met and married Ruth. If that had not happened, then Ruth would not have moved back to Bethlehem with Naomi, and she would not have met Boaz and became an ancestor of Christ. Now the next one we're going to look at, now remember, in Matthew, in the genealogy, we read verses 5 and 6. So verse 6 stated that David begat Solomon by her who was the wife of Uriah. Now, who was the wife of Uriah? Let's take a look back to 2 Samuel and see who was the wife of Uriah. And we're going to look in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now it came to pass in the spring of the year, at that time, when the kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. So, chapter 11, verse 1 tells us that this is a time of war. David sent his servants out. He sent his warriors out. They were at war, but he did not join them. Then verse 2 says, And it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Now during that time, the women bathed outside in a garden that was shielded from the public. It was inside their own courtyard. Men couldn't just walk by and see them. The reason that David was able to see Bathsheba bathing was because he was on the roof of his house looking out across the city. So chapter 11, verse 2 says that he looked out from his rooftop and saw a beautiful woman bathing. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him and lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, so sent and told David, and said, I am with child. Now, in the next part, we're going to learn what happens in this story. But right now, we know that the men of the city are at war. David is at home, and he has taken another man's wife, and she has conceived by him. So stay tuned for the next part.